What's up, Bug Doug with D&E in the Garage? Happy Memorial Day. For those that don't know, here in the United States, what is Memorial Day? It's the de facto beginning of summer, right? But in a much deeper level, and the real meaning of the holiday is not just a 3-day weekend, it's not just an excuse for a barbecue. The purpose for Memorial Day is for us as a country to come together and thank and commemorate and memorialize those who have served in our armed forces. Now, in that vein, I think it would be a good day to discuss the history and commemorate the Jeeps that have served in our armed forces. For those that don't know, I can't imagine there's anybody. Jeep began not as most vehicles begin as a civilian vehicle, but as a military vehicle. In response to World War II, the United States government commissioned a lightweight reconnaissance vehicle, and after a convoluted process involving many companies, which we will discuss now, we were left with the iconic, the ultimate, the Jeep. Now, as I said, this story begins in 1940. In 1940, the United States is not in World War II. We are staring nervously across the pond at what those darn Nazis are doing, and we want to find a way to help supply our allies is the wrong word because we were not involved, but we wanted to support England, we wanted to support the Soviet Union, we wanted to support the French, anybody who was over there trying to stop the spread of the Nazi regime. Now, an interesting side note there is FDR was dedicated to the idea of getting supplies to what would become the Allied powers in Europe, but he was barred from doing so by Congress. He was not allowed to provide any type of supplies to a belligerent in a war which the United States was not involved with. So what he did was he came up with a program called Lend-Lease. He said, fine, I can't sell you supplies, I'll lend them to you. I'll lease them to you. And he kind of just completely subverted Congress in that way. I mean, obviously it was for a good cause, but it was really a miscarriage of the presidential position to go around Congress like that, but obviously for a good cause. Now, in this vein, the United States wanted to come up with a lightweight reconnaissance vehicle, and I've talked about the in-depth history of Jeep in a number of videos. If you want a specific history of the whole timeline, I recommend you go and check out the card up in the corner there. I did a whole history of Jeep from soup to nuts. You can find that there. For today, we're just going to touch on military service. So 1940, the U.S. government, the quartermaster, puts out a list of requirements to essentially all domestic automakers and says, who wants to come up with a vehicle that fits these requirements? And they were pretty intense. It had to be able to carry a crew of 3. It had to be no more than 1,200 pounds. It had to have at least 50 horsepower, which at the time was a big deal. It had to be 4-wheel drive. That's the key here. There were very few 4-wheel drive vehicles at the time. You had Marmon Harrington that made conversions for Fords, but that's really not the only, but the only real reliable, rugged source of 4-wheel drive at the time. Long story short, 2 companies come back with working prototypes. The reason there's only 2 companies that these requirements were too strict. I mean, everybody looked at them and said, we can't do that. That's not possible. So you have the Willys Overland Company. They came back with a design, but they requested more time. That was the other problem. The timeline for this prototype to be in the hands of the government for testing was 49 days, which is an incredibly truncated time to design, build, and ship out a prototype vehicle. So Willys said, we can do it, but we need more time. And as a result, they were penalized. And the contract went to the other company that had supplied a prototype. That other company was the Bantam Car Company out of Butler, Pennsylvania. Bantam is the true origin point for Jeep. You're about to find out how Bantam, Willys, and one other company seriously influenced the first years of Jeep, and ultimately Jeep would go on to become a Willys Overland product, but Bantam is the beginning. Alright, the Bantam Blitz Buggy, also known as the Bantam Reconnaissance Car, or BRC-70, was designed by Carl Probst using off-the-shelf components. Now, the thing to know about Bantam at this time in history is they were a company that was going under. They did not have many resources, they did not have much money, which is why they laid it all on the table to design this vehicle, because this contract could save the company. But the catch was they were using parts bin parts to design their Bantam Blitz buggy or BRC 70 to the point where they went to a junkyard and got the trunk lid from some other existing car to use as the hood. I mean, it's truly a hobbled together vehicle, but it was a highly capable vehicle, if not a little bit underpowered, and it did meet the government's specifications. So the government takes this car and they begin testing it, and they begin looking into the Bantam Car Company, and they say, wait a minute. These guys are never going to be able to produce the volume of vehicles we're going to need. So they call the other company who had submitted design, Willys Overland, and they also called the ultimate in American auto manufacturing in 1940, of course, Henry Ford. And they say, Henry, buddy, you got to help us out, all right? Revisit this. And they ask Willys and Ford to look at the Bantam designs, and they say, guys, come on. Design something that you guys can build for us. Please take what Bantam did that we already like and make it your own. So after a bit of time, Ford submits for the government's approval the Ford Pygmy. This vehicle was hand built in the Dearborn, Michigan site. It was the first to feature the flat slatted grille with headlights behind the grille. Now this is key. This design right here that you see, 9 slats, this is the iconic World War II Jeep grill that we all associate. This is our brand right here. I mean, granted, the World War II ones had 9, ours have 7. The important thing to know is this design was designed by Ford. It was not designed by Willys. Willys was using a sturdier welded version, but it was more expensive. It was overkill. Ford was the first one to design the stamped steel grille with their Ford Pygmy, and eventually, and I'm going to get to pre-production in a minute, it was adopted by Willys as well. Obviously, Willys also submitted their own design for approval. They designed what they called the Willys Quad. This was essentially very similar to the Bantam reconnaissance car and the Ford Pygmy. All of these designed featured a fuel tank under the seat, a 2-piece folding windshield, 4-wheel drive, and they met all the other government standards. The difference and what made Willys Overland stand out was the L134 Go Devil engine. For the time period, this small 4-cylinder engine, which created 60 horsepower and 105 foot-pounds of torque, was an absolute anomaly. Nothing that Ford had. They were using a tractor engine, which I'm going to get to in a minute. They used an agricultural tractor engine for their Ford Pygmy, and Bantam had a crate motor that they had gotten from Continental for their. Both engines were serviceable for the task, but the Go Devil was hand and fist above the others. So this time the government has the BRC 70, they have the Ford Pygmy, and they have the Willys Quad, and they ask each company to please tweak them in various ways. And what you end up with is the second generation Bantam, the BRC 40. You end up with the second generation Ford Pygmy, the Ford GP, and you end up with the second generation Willys Quad, the Willys MA, stood for Military Model A. All right, and they were basically the same as the originals with small tweaks. They all started. If they all started here, Ford, Willys, Bantam, by the second generation, they were all much closer. They'd adopted some of each other's ideas. The vehicles had been tested side by side at various government testing facilities, and they were starting to come together. You could still tell them apart, but they were starting to come together and sort of all look the same. All right, and again, the only thing that really stood out about any one of the three was that Willys Go Devil engine. All right, they all had 4-wheel drive, and they met all the standards that the government wanted, but that Go Devil engine, the government said, it's the only one. It's the only one we can use. Now, the problem with the Ford engine, what do you know about tractor engines? Agriculture. Picture an agricultural tractor. All right, what is it designed to do? It's designed to go low and slow all day. You're plowing a field and you're doing it for 10 hours straight, but you're not changing RPMs constantly. It's kind of just tractoring along, right? Well, that's the engine they had was great for that. It was very reliable and had just enough power, but in a dynamic environment that a military vehicle, revving up, heavy load, no load, they couldn't keep up, and they would break often, and they were difficult to fix. The Continental motor was a little underpowered. It wasn't a bad motor, but it was underpowered. But the Go Devil engine had the power and it had the reliability. In the end, That's what they wanted. They wanted to go with the Willys MA. So Willys is awarded this contract. They ask for one more set of revisions, which takes it from the Willys Military Model A to the Willys Military Model B. The Model B, the Willys MB, that's what this is. Every World War II Jeep you see is the Willys MB. Now here's the other thing. Willys still couldn't produce as much as the government was going to need. At this point, the United States entering the war is imminent, and we know we're going to need mass supply. So they ask Ford, will you please also build Willys MBs? The Ford built Willys MBs were known as the Ford GPWs. They were essentially the same. Now there are variations, especially in the beginning, in like the 1942 models, where there'd be variations between the Willys MB and the Ford GPW. They look very similar. Some of the frames were a little bit different. For the most part, they used all the same parts. An interesting thing that Henry Ford did is he stamped every part possible with that stylistic Ford F, every part on the GPW, so that if one of these broke in the field, it could be determined, no, that wasn't a Ford one, that was a Willys one. When I did my original history of Jeep video, I didn't know that, and I found that out since. A viewer pointed that out, and I looked into it. It turns out it was right. I originally asserted that it was an ego thing, because that's what I had read somewhere. But no, he wanted to make sure that if one of these failed and it caused havoc on the battlefield, he wanted everybody to know it wasn't the Ford one that failed, it was the Willys one. By the end of the war, Willys had built 353,000 Willys MBs, and Ford had built 280,000 GPWs, again based on the Willys MB. Bantam was not left out of this, though. They were awarded various other contracts, one of which was trailers, which would be towed behind the Jeeps, and they were able to stay afloat. This contract did save them for the time being, though they did not survive through the 1940s. It's just the way of the world. Now, during World War II, there were some very interesting variations on the Willys MB. One of them is the Willys MT. It's actually a 6x6 3/4 ton truck. Just a it looks like an MB, just kind of on steroids. Another one is the Willys MLW2, which was essentially just a long wheelbase. They called it the Jungle Jeep. Think CJ5 and CJ6. You got the CJ5 with the CJ6 being the longer wheelbase. The MLW2 is just the longer wheelbase of the MB, and they did use these a lot in the Pacific campaign. They made for good ambulances and other utility type trucks. Another concept vehicle that actually never saw any use was the Willys WAC, or Willys air-cooled Jeeplet. This was meant to be a very tiny air-cooled, very tiny Jeep with an air-cooled engine that could be airdropped in. It was going to be super light. The war expired before they were actually able to put it into production, but would have been really interesting. Imagine like a golf cart based on the MB. Now, I mentioned that Ford actually designed this grille and not Willys. That's true. The first 25,000 Willys MBs built in 1942 had the welded bar grille, which they later realized was overkill, and they adopted the stamped grille. Now, as I mentioned in the beginning of the video, the Willys MB had 9 slats, right? In the late 40s, when Willys said, hey, we should probably trademark the Jeep name and make Jeep our business, they went to trademark the 9-slat grille, and Ford raised their hand and said, well, you can't do that. And so what they had to do was change it to 7. So the iconic 7-slat grille that is Jeep. I mean, that's the most, how do you know a Jeep? If you don't know what it is coming up, oh, does it have 7 slats? Yep, it's a Jeep, done and done. That really isn't a Willys or a Jeep thing. It was a Ford thing that we kind of stole. Another interesting thing is that it has been argued that Ford had just as much of a claim on the designs to the Willys MB as Willys did by the end of the war, having produced them and everything. Had they wanted to, they likely could have pursued their own GPW style vehicle, but apparently Jeep didn't want to, or Ford did not want to. They didn't see any future in this odd little open-top utilitarian four-wheel drive vehicle. How wrong they were. Now, so at this point, we have to talk about the etymology of the word Jeep. There are many actually. suggested origins for the name Jeep. All right, one that I really like actually comes from the Popeye cartoons. In Popeye, there was a character named Eugene the Jeep, and he was this magical little creature who could do anything and jump through dimensions and go anywhere, and he always had the answer for whatever the problem was. And this Eugene the Jeep character actually debuts in 1936, so it's completely plausible that GIs in these go anywhere, do anything, solve any problem vehicles could have been familiar with the Eugene the Jeep character and decided this thing's a little Jeep. It's a little Eugene the Jeep. So that's one. It's my favorite. I don't know. Nobody knows for a fact. And I know down in the comments a bunch of people are going to present it as fact. Oh no, for fact this is what it is. But in all my years of researching on the Jeep brand, this is one thing that you just can't nail down. Nobody knows where the term Jeep definitively comes from. But this is my favorite. Other possibilities are from the Ford GP, which was the second generation of the Pygmy. I mean, that's not a big stretch to make. It's called the Ford GP Jeep. Now, just because the Ford GP was not the ultimate choice by the government, they still built 5,000 of them and deployed them when they were in that secondary testing phase. Same thing with the Bantam BRC-40 and the Willys MA. I mean, they had these companies build several thousand of each of them and send them out to the troops. So even though the GP or the BRC-40 was not the Jeep or vehicle for World War II, plenty of World War II GIs, not only American, actually mostly, especially Allied, the Soviet Union and England used the Ford and Bantam versions when they were in their, call it beta testing. So it's not crazy that GIs couldn't have fallen in love with the Ford GP and, you know, mush those two letters together, GP, Jeep. It's a Jeep. It's Ford Jeep. Done and done. And obviously the interesting point there is if that's true, we don't only have Ford to thank for our symbol, we have them to thank for our name, you know. Additionally, Joe Frazier, the then president of Willis Overland, claims that in 1941 he coined the phrase at a press release for the Willys Quad. He was trying to raise awareness. Obviously, they wanted to get that contract. They didn't have it yet. And he claims that the term Jeep is his brainchild. Now, this is the, I don't want to say the least credible, but it has the most holes. Nobody remembers said press release. There's no record of it. And you can kind of see why he would want to take credit for that. Whereas the other two, Eugene the Jeep and the Ford GP, you don't really even have to make an argument as to why they're plausible. It's self-evident. So whether it's one of those three or any of the several other possibilities, we will never know. Personally, I don't care. I just like that they exist now. Now, after the, as World War II is completely done in 1949 and we were starting to ramp up for Korea, we realized that the MB needed a successor. This came in the form of the M38. It was very similar to the Willys MB. It was actually based off the civilian CJ3A, but with a much beefier frame and suspension. It featured a one-piece windshield, bottom-mounted windshield, lifting shackles front and rear, a pintle hook tow hook system, larger tires than the stock, a Ramsey winch, a 24-volt fully waterproof electrical system, and some even included a snorkel apparatus for large water fording. About 60,000 of these were built before we decided that we needed to tweak it even more. This came in the form of the Willys M38A1 in 1952. Now this is extremely similar to the CJ5 that would come out in 1955, but obviously not based on it as it didn't exist yet. It was the first Jeep to use the Willys Hurricane engine, but in every other way it's very similar to the CJ5. The M38A1 is to the CJ5 as the M38 is to the CJ3A. They're very similar, just beefed up for military use, and they include some features, some mounting points that your civilian Jeeps would not include. Some variations of the M38A1 are going to include the M38A1C, which was fitted with a 150mm anti-tank recoilless rifle, the M170 ambulance, which essentially would be an ambulance attachment or box for the back to make this a mobile battlefield ambulance, of course. And then again, they kind of recreate that WAC Willys air-cooled Jeep with the BC Bobcat, which again is the nickname was going to be the Aero Jeep. It was going to be a 115-pound, very tiny version of the M38A1 that could be air dropped in. Again, though, it was never actually needed and never really brought to market. An important thing to note here: the successor to the M38A1 is the M151. This is not a Jeep. This is not a Jeep. The M151 is not a Jeep. It was built by Ford, all right? Willys lost the contract for the light reconnaissance vehicles after the M138A1, and it went to Ford. If you look at an M151, it is vastly different in two very significant ways. The first is superficial, though I think significant. The grille is 4 or 5 sideways slants. They had to do this because by this time, Willys had patented this grille design, so Ford had to use sideways slats. The other very, very important way that the 151 is different from any of the Jeeps that came before it is that it's independent front suspension. Now, anybody who's watched this channel knows that I hate independent front suspension anyway, but one of the reasons is because of the 151. The 151 had this terrible, terrible habit of flipping over, and since it had no roof, and in many cases had no roll cage, this was a very serious problem. Now, why did it flip over so much more than its Jeep predecessors? And I explained this in my other History of Jeep video as well. Picture what happens if you go over a jump and you catch air in a solid front axle vehicle. You go over the jump and your axle is going to separate from the body, but they're going to remain parallel. All right, and then when you land, they're going to come down together. Now imagine what happens. You've seen old videos of old military Jeeps bouncing over these dunes. Now picture the 151 going over one of these dunes and catching air. The body goes up, and these independent front suspension wheels, they don't come down straight. They tuck in. Right? You know, that's how independent front suspension works. Your control arm is right here, and it's pivoting at the body, and so when it is hanging in the air, it comes down like this. Now, if that Jeep doesn't come down perfectly straight and it lands a little bit slanted, what's going to happen is this wheel is going to snap. And that's what happened with the 151 alarmingly often. It would go up in the air, these wheels would tuck, it would land a little bit sideways, and the control arm and everything would just flip underneath the Jeep, sending the truck tumbling. Now I bring this up because the 151 gave the Jeep a bad name. Everybody knows that Jeeps flip over, right? One of the origins of this issue, first of all, they don't flip over all that much, considering what people do to them. But one of the origins, and I'm firmly off on a tangent here, I apologize, but one of the origins of this is GIs who saw the awful carnage of 151 wrecks would come back and say, damn man, that Jeep flipped over and it killed those guys, you know? The Jeep name was so iconic and so ingrained in the military by the time the 151 comes along that it didn't matter who made it. Ford could have made it, Chevy could have made it, friggin' Toyota could have made it. It doesn't matter. It's a Jeep. It looks like a Jeep, which they do, the 151. So at this point, there are no more Jeeps the way we know them for military use. By the United States military. After this, Jeep or Willys Overland's contribution is the M715. All right, the M715 was in production from 1967 to 1969 and in service from 1967 to 1976. It was a 1 1/4 ton truck called the 5/4 ton for obvious reasons. It was based on the Jeep Gladiator, which is a very cool truck. It is, in my opinion, the best looking pickup truck ever. But unfortunately, for military use, these trucks weren't that great. Now, the M715 comes in between the Dodge M37 and the Dodge M880 series trucks. Dodge lost the contract there for a little bit, for a few years, and Jeep snuck in with the Gladiator-based M715. Now, the problem was, first of all, the engine was underpowered. It was a 3.8 liter Tornado straight 6. It had huge oil consumption issues, and it was wildly inefficient and underpowered. To make up for it, they gave it a Dana 60 front and a Dana 70 full float rear with 586 gears. This led to a top speed of about 55 miles an hour. Unfortunately, on top of the issues of reliability and just general performance, it had build quality issues. The welds would break, so these guys would be out in Vietnam with these M715s, and the welds on the frames would be breaking, so they'd be in the field either trying to do some hokey field repair or actually hiring in-country contractors to try to fix these things. In general, and it hurts me to say this because they're damn good looking trucks, man. If you see an M715 all decked out, it's got the big front brush guard, the military camo, some kind of big heavy artillery mounted in the back. I mean, it's a good looking truck, but they were not good for military use. Gladiators are much better because we're not expecting them to bounce through the jungles of Vietnam with Charlie nipping at our heels. We just wanted to move a few hay bales around or something. But unfortunately, the 715 military service is not really all that well received, and people who drove them did not think very highly of them. Again, very unfortunate. It hurts me to say it. They went back to the Dodge with the M880 after that, and Jeep, as we know it, has never built a vehicle for the U.S. military since the M175. There have been adaptations. There's a company who adapted TJs for use in the Israeli army. You've seen pictures of XJs and other Wranglers and other CJs who have somehow made their way into military use, but as far as production vehicles that had government contracts to be built for the government, it ends as we know them with the open-top light reconnaissance vehicles with the M38A1, and then it fully ends no more Jeep vehicles for government contracts in the United States with the M715. Now in 2010, FCA put out a concept vehicle. They called it the New Kaiser 715. It is essentially an homage, a throwback to the military M715. Now you can tell from the picture and how awesome it is that we never got it. They're never going to actually build anything that cool. But dang, is it good looking. Now, here's where our story takes an interesting turn. I've discussed all the Jeep vehicles that actually served in the military. And it's a bummer that since the late 60s, really, we haven't really been involved. Hummer took over. As you know, Ford stepped in with the M151, but Jeep is building military Jeeps today in the form of the J8. Right now, the J8 is based on a JKU, and this vehicle is absolutely fascinating. They're building it for government contracts. They also use it for underground mining. That's how beefy it is. The bummer is that it's not really being used by the U.S. military. There are some exceptions, but for the most part, it's being used by the Egyptian and Israeli armies right now. What this is a JKU with larger brakes, larger axles, larger suspension components. This is a JKU with leaf springs in the back. This isn't a JKU that they adapted. You know, it's like, oh, well, we'll swap in better axles. No. It's built on a JKU body, but they redid everything. The frame is beefed up. The suspension is beefed up. The rear suspension is completely changed. There's leaf springs in the back. They all come with hood-mounted snorkels and air filtration systems to allow it to ford 30 inches of water and sustain driving through a sandstorm for 5 hours. Anybody who's driven through any kind of windy, sandy environment knows that that stuff gets everywhere. So these things are designed so that they can survive driving through a sandstorm for 5 hours. And here is the absolute coolest part. They make a 4-door JKU version. That makes perfect sense. They also make a 2-door version, but it's not based on the JK. It's a JKU 2-door. It's essentially a scrambler. I was just talking about this last week. Anybody who saw my video about how they should have fixed Jeep knows that I was just talking about the possibility of a 2-door long body JK, and when I was doing my research for this video, I happened to find it the day that I posted that video. So what they have is this long 2-door JK pickup truck that's being outfitted for military use. And like I said, it's not being sold to the public. You cannot go to your local Jeep dealership and say, can I get one of those J8s? Because that stuff looks awesome. You have to have a military contract. That's the bad news. The good news is there is an American company, American Expedition Vehicles, that is currently working with FCA to strike up a deal to let them buy component J8s. And what a component vehicle is, it's a vehicle that's 99% there. 99% of the way all put together so that they can sell it to the public, but they're not selling them a vehicle. So that FCA is not selling finished J8s to any one individual person, and American Expedition Vehicles is not an auto manufacturer. They're not an auto seller. They're selling auto parts. Who cares if it's 99% put together? The only thing it's missing is an engine. And these kit cars, is what they're essentially trying to say they are, will come capable of receiving either a 2.8 VM diesel or the 5.7 liter Hemi. Oh my God. Now, from what I can understand, only 120 of these are going to be made available to American Expedition Vehicles. A lot of those are likely to go to private security companies or people that are just richer than God. Certainly none of them are going to make it to D&E's garage here. But someday, I hope I can find one of those two-door, long body JK Scramblers. They don't call it a Scrambler, I'm just calling it a Scrambler, with the 5.7 Hemi. Whew. It's a dang good looking vehicle, man. And hopefully on top of that, I hope that at some point the American military starts using Jeeps again. I think Jeep has come a long way, and they're really branching their brand out, and I think potentially we're positioning ourselves where we could be big enough and stable enough again that maybe the government comes back around and says, hey man, this is what I need, and Jeep can say, cool man, this is what I got for you. Because I'd love to see Jeeps out there serving our country again. And that's it, man. That is the history of all the vehicles that have officially served with the U.S. military, all the Jeeps anyway. To any veterans out there watching today, thank you very much for your service. We truly appreciate it. Here on D&E in the Garage, I hope everyone has a safe and enjoyable Memorial Day weekend, and we'll see you guys again soon, right? Thanks for watching. See you later.